It's like I'm so desperate to get a mental break from taking care of everyone that my mind is trying to make something physically wrong with me. I'm completely overwhelmed trying to take care of the 3 kids. I feel like I'm drowning every day.
Those are Lindsay Clancy's own words, pulled from a journal that's now sitting in the record of a first-degree murder trial, read aloud in open court, describing a mind that felt like it was breaking apart in real time. At the same trial, entries from that same journal describe a marriage under strain, a husband she felt disconnected from, and a fear she couldn't fully name. Right as online speculation about that same husband, his changed clothes, his unexplained trips, and the inconsistencies in his own account, has exploded into its own parallel investigation.
What's interesting, Mark, is on social media, you've got this whole narrative that has erupted where people are blaming the ex-husband, Patrick Clancy. You know, he's now remarried.
Oh, these kids were a witness. They've seen things that they can no longer unsee, and unfortunately, instead of being the hero dad, and this was a very unfortunate turn of events, now he had to take them down in the process because they were witnesses to what has occurred.
He yelled, "She killed the effing kids." Like, the way that is worded is so freaking weird. I'm starting to believe this theory.
Are we ever going to get to hear from Lindsay? Because this entire thing is pushed by what Patrick's narrative is, and it's driving me insane. Something is off.
And somewhere inside all of it, for the first time since January 2023, the public is finally hearing Lindsay Clancy's own voice in that courtroom.
Yes, Your Honor.
Which raises the question this case still hasn't answered 3 years later. Whose version of what happened inside that Duxbury home is actually true? That's the unresolved center of this story, and it's exactly the kind of thread we exist to pull apart on the fatal truth. So if you're new here, subscribe, because we're not walking away from this one until the jury does. Lindsay Marie Clancy was, by every account before January 2023, an unremarkable success story. Born in 1990, she trained as a labor and delivery nurse and spent years working in that unit at Massachusetts General Hospital, helping deliver other people's children for a living. She married Patrick Clancy in December 2016, and the two settled into a colonial home on Summer Street in Duxbury, a quiet South Shore town outside Boston. They built a family fast. Their daughter Cora arrived on Christmas Eve 2017, their son Dawson followed in September 2019, and their youngest, Callan, was born in May 2022. Patrick worked in tech, employed by Microsoft, and by outward appearances, the Clancys were living the version of family life most people say they want. 3 kids under 6, 2 working professionals, a house with a backyard playset. What the outside world didn't see was what was happening inside Lindsay after Callan's birth. She had experienced some anxiety returning to work after her first 2 children, but according to the criminal complaint, she had always managed it. This time was different. By the fall of 2022, roughly 4 months after her 3rd child was born, Lindsay's mental state had begun to unravel, in a way that would later become the single most contested fact in this entire case. She started keeping a journal, one prosecutors and defense attorneys would spend years fighting over the meaning of. In it, she wrote about insomnia so severe she went nearly 2 days without sleep. She wrote about brain fog, so thick she couldn't plan her own day. She described obsessively tracking her infant son's naps down to the minute, driving him around in the car for hours just to get him to sleep, and feeling crushing guilt she couldn't explain. "I want help. I want to be well," she wrote in one entry. In another, she admitted to telling her husband, while their baby cried, that she wanted to die. By December 2022, things had escalated to a point that couldn't be ignored. On New Year's Eve, weeks before the killings, Patrick brought Lindsay to the hospital after she told him she was having what she called intrusive thoughts about harming their 3 children. She was admitted to an inpatient psychiatric program at McLean Hospital outside Boston. 5 days later, she texted Patrick that she didn't belong there, told her doctors the intrusive thoughts were gone, and was discharged with a new prescription. 2 days after that, the family threw Cora a 5th birthday party at a trampoline park. By her husband's own later account, Lindsay seemed to be improving. That improvement, whatever it actually was, lasted less than a month, and whatever was really happening underneath it is the turning point this entire trial now hinges on. January 24th, 2023, began like nothing was wrong. Lindsay took Cora to a pediatrician appointment that morning, and afterward, the family played in the snow together. That afternoon, prosecutors say, Lindsay sent Patrick out on an errand. First to a CVS in Kingston to pick up stool softener for Cora, then to grab dinner at a restaurant in Plymouth. By the time he left the house, according to the Commonwealth, Lindsay had already been researching methods and tracking, on her phone, how long the round trip would take him. At 6:11 p.m., Duxbury police were dispatched to the Summer Street home for a reported suicide attempt. A woman had cut herself and jumped from a second-story window. When officers arrived, they found Lindsay on the ground outside, breathing, semi-conscious, her cuts no longer actively bleeding. Patrick was with her. As first responders began assessing his wife, Patrick went inside to check on the children. Within moments, officers heard him screaming. When they reached the basement, Patrick reportedly told them flatly, "She killed the kids." Cora and Callan were found together in a den area of the basement. Dawson was alone, in his father's home office. All three had exercise bands tied around their necks. Cora, 5, and Dawson, 3, were pronounced dead at the hospital that same night. Callan, only 7 months old, was placed on life support and clung on for 3 more days. He turned 8 months old in the hospital before he died on January 27th. Lindsay's own injuries from the fall left her paralyzed from the waist down. She was arraigned 2 weeks later, on February 7th, appearing by video from her hospital bed, charged with 3 counts each of first-degree murder, strangulation, and assault and battery with a dangerous weapon. She pleaded not guilty, and from the very first hearing, her attorney, Kevin Reddington, made the defense's position unmistakable. Lindsay did not deny killing her children. She was going to argue she wasn't in her right mind when she did it. That single admission is what makes this case so unusual, and it's also where the real fight begins. Because not guilty here doesn't mean I didn't do it. It means I'm not criminally responsible for what I did. Under Massachusetts law, if a jury agrees Lindsay lacked criminal responsibility due to mental illness at the time of the killings, she wouldn't walk free. She'd very likely be committed to a state psychiatric hospital rather than sent to prison for life. That distinction is the entire trial. And once investigators started unsealing the evidence behind that defense, the case only got stranger. Search warrants unsealed before Lindsay's arraignment revealed just how documented her mental collapse had been. Her phone and journals contained not just the entries about insomnia and guilt, but references to self-harm and, according to prosecutors, expressions about wanting to harm her own children. Her defense team later revealed that in the 4 months leading up to the killings, Lindsay had been prescribed 13 different psychiatric medications, among them Valium, Wellbutrin, Klonopin, Prozac, Seroquel, and Ambien, several carrying suicide risk warnings on their own. Whether that was a woman being carefully treated for a serious illness or a woman being medicated into a psychotic break nobody caught in time, is precisely what the two sides in that courtroom cannot agree on. And it's the fault line the entire trial has been built around ever since jury selection began this summer. That fault line has a name, and Reddington has built much of his defense directly on top of it: polypharmacy. Court records show that between October 2022 and January 2023, 6 different healthcare providers, 3 psychiatrists, 2 nurse practitioners, and a physician were prescribing, discontinuing, and adjusting Lindsay's medications, often without a clear picture of what the others had already put her on. By the time of the killings, that list had grown to include multiple antidepressants, layered on top of several benzodiazepines and a sleep aid, an escalating cocktail Reddington argues no single provider was actually coordinating. His argument isn't simply that Lindsay was overmedicated, it's that the rapid switching and stacking of powerful psychiatric drugs left her involuntarily intoxicated, her nervous system so destabilized that whatever postpartum psychosis was already forming underneath it got violently accelerated rather than treated. It's a defense built to argue Lindsay wasn't fully in control of her own mind on January 24th, not because of an illness alone, but because of what was poured into her body trying to fix it. The Commonwealth has pushed back hard on that framing, suggesting through its own witnesses that Lindsay wasn't a passive victim of her prescriptions at all, that she repeatedly pushed her own providers to change her medications, sometimes against their advice, and that she wasn't even taking all 13 drugs simultaneously, with several barely touched. Whether that pattern reflects a desperate woman chasing any relief she could find, or someone quietly engineering the exact chemical conditions the defense would later need, is a question this jury still hasn't answered, and it's one more layer sitting underneath everything else this trial is trying to untangle. Before the jury even reached a single fact from January 24th, the fight over who Lindsay Clancy really was had already started. The Commonwealth's opening framed her as calculated, a woman who, prosecutors argued, acted intentionally, rationally, and swiftly, someone so controlling about her household and her children's routines that when she felt she was losing her grip on that control, she engineered a plan to remove her husband from the house before acting. The defense told a different story entirely, a woman suffering an undiagnosed and untreated case of postpartum psychosis, made catastrophically worse by a cocktail of medications, who had no idea what she was doing was wrong. Both sides agree on what happened. Neither side agrees on why, and that's the question this entire trial exists to answer. But here's where it gets complicated, because as the Commonwealth started calling its own witnesses to prove Lindsay was calculating and cold, almost every one of them said the opposite. Some of the earliest testimony came from the people who knew Lindsay best in daily life, starting with the family's former nanny, who described a woman who left detailed notes about nap schedules, food prep, and cut up vegetables for the kids. When asked directly whether she'd found any of it controlling, the nanny said no, she found it appropriate. Asked if she'd had concerns watching Lindsay interact with her children, the answer, again, was no. She was, the nanny told the jury plainly, a wonderful mom. She went further, telling a state trooper during the investigation that she had loved Lindsay. The family's longtime pediatrician, who had cared for all three Clancy children since birth, offered the same assessment on the stand, glowing, unprompted, and notably, delivered as a witness called by the prosecution, not the defense. So which is it? Was Lindsay Clancy a woman meticulously executing a plan, or a woman everyone closest to her says was simply a good mother having a medical catastrophe nobody caught in time? That's the exact question we want to hear from you on. If a defendant's own accusers keep describing her as a loving parent, does that undercut a premeditation case, or does it not matter at all next to what actually happened in that basement? Drop your answer in the comments. We're reading every one of them. The medical testimony is where the trial has turned into a genuine battle of interpretation. Multiple emergency room and psychiatric witnesses were called to establish Lindsay's condition in the days after the killings, and Reddington went after nearly every one of them on cross-examination. One ER doctor was pressed hard on a discrepancy over Lindsay's recorded core body temperature, 82 degrees, with Reddington repeatedly demanding she confirm what her own medical records actually said rather than what she remembered from treating hundreds of patients since. A forensic psychiatrist who evaluated Lindsay for roughly 20 minutes while she was still intubated was forced to admit, under cross, that she'd found no evidence of homicidal ideation in Lindsay's records, but also hadn't known Lindsay had been kept on a suicide watch, hadn't known her parents were barred from visiting her, and hadn't known Lindsay had asked to change her end-of-life directive from her husband to her parents, just one day after being taken off a ventilator. That detail, Lindsay asking, while still hospitalized and barely able to speak, to remove Patrick as her medical decision-maker, became one of the most quietly explosive pieces of testimony in the entire trial, because neither side could fully explain what it meant, and the judge sustained an objection before prosecutors could even finish asking why. Then there was the moment that briefly turned the courtroom itself into the story. During autopsy testimony so graphic that Lindsay was seen sobbing and had to be escorted out, Reddington accused the prosecution of being caught on a hot microphone muttering "shut her up," while his client cried. He refused to take the matter to a private sidebar, insisting it go on the record in open court. The prosecution's own faces reportedly looked stunned by the accusation. Massachusetts prosecutors later reviewed the recording and said the audio actually caught someone saying, "shut it off," a comment about the camera, not about Lindsay, and possibly not even from the prosecution table at all. The presiding judge, William Sullivan, used the moment to issue a blunt warning to the entire courtroom: no further disruptive comments, no warnings next time, straight to removal. It was a small moment in a trial full of much larger stakes, but it's exactly the kind of detail that's fueled an enormous, sprawling conversation happening entirely outside that courtroom, online, about who's really telling the truth in this case. Because while jurors have been weighing medical testimony, The internet has been building its own case, and it isn't really about Lindsay at all. It's about her ex-husband. Patrick Clancy took the stand and, by multiple accounts, delivered flat, clipped, almost affectless answers about the deaths of his own children, describing Cora as a girly girl and Dawson as a Paw Patrol fan in language so brief some commenters online called it cold. That flatness collided head-on with reporting that Patrick had broken down crying during recesses, left the courtroom during the 911 call recording, and let out what one observer described as a primal roar the night his children died. Details the jury in the room hasn't actually been allowed to hear. Online, that contrast has curdled into full-blown suspicion. Amateur sleuths have pointed to surveillance footage from that January afternoon showing Patrick apparently wearing boots and a half-zip jacket inside the CVS, then arriving at the restaurant minutes later in what looks like sneakers and a different, full-zip jacket. A detail some have framed as evidence of something being hidden, though others, including one prominent true crime commentator, have suggested a far more mundane explanation: New England winter weather and wet boots. Commenters have also seized on the fact that no fingerprints were recovered from the exercise bands used to strangle the children, treating the absence of evidence as evidence itself, even though investigators have simply confirmed the print testing came back inconclusive. The theory goes further still, and this is where a second, darker thread of speculation enters the conversation, one that isn't just about where Patrick was, but about what he chose to do while he was away. 2 months before the killings, Patrick took a work trip to New York City. A detail defense attorneys initially suggested happened closer to the murders than it actually did, before being corrected that it was over 2 months prior. Around that same stretch, he also took Cora on an extended trip to San Diego, leaving Lindsay alone with the other 2 children for days at a time. And weeks earlier still, on the day Lindsay was admitted to a mental health facility in Rhode Island, Patrick drove her there himself, then spent that same afternoon taking Dawson skiing. To online commentators, and to Reddington's own line of cross-examination, that pattern, repeatedly stepping away and leaving a woman he knew was struggling alone with 3 young children, right down to sending her on a routine CVS and dinner run that left her by herself for roughly 25 minutes on January 24th, reads less like coincidence and more like a husband who understood exactly how fragile she was and left the door open anyway, whether knowingly or not. The defense has used that same 25-minute window to argue it undercuts the prosecution's own theory of a calculated plan. If Lindsay's crisis was truly as dangerous as prosecutors claim, why would Patrick have left her alone at all, let alone repeatedly, for hours and even days at a stretch, rather than just a short errand run? The counter to all of this, voiced by friends and even by some commentators covering the trial, is far simpler: that Patrick was a stretched thin father of 3 trying to hold a household together during a mental health crisis nobody around him had a real playbook for, making ordinary, unremarkable choices, a work trip, a ski day, a takeout run, that only look sinister in hindsight, once you already know how the day ended. Online speculation has spun that New York trip into something else entirely, an alleged affair, a theory that gained new fuel when it was revealed during the trial, not through rumor, but through Reddington himself in open court, that Patrick has since remarried. His new wife, Dr. Rachel Danis, is a reproductive specialist in New York City. The 2 wed in April 2026 overlooking Central Park, and some online have pointed to a resemblance between her and Lindsay as proof of something sinister. There is no public evidence connecting Danis to the timeline before the killings, and Patrick himself has said in a prior interview that he wasn't married to a monster, but to someone who got sick, hardly the language of a man protecting himself. Still, the theory persists loudly enough that it's become one of the defining threads of public conversation around this trial, running in parallel to, and sometimes louder than, the actual medical evidence being presented in court. There's a second layer to the online skepticism, and it has nothing to do with Patrick specifically. It's aimed at the Massachusetts State Police. Commentators covering the trial have repeatedly drawn a direct line back to the Karen Reed case, another Massachusetts trial that left a large segment of the public deeply distrustful of state police testimony and evidence handling. That lingering suspicion appears to be shaping how some viewers interpret every piece of forensic evidence presented against Lindsay, regardless of whether it has anything to do with the earlier case at all. And running underneath both of those threads is a third, broader current. Accusations that the prosecution itself is being unfairly harsh, that two female prosecutors building a premeditated murder case against a mother who nearly died trying to kill herself amounts to, as some online commentary has framed it, an anti-woman prosecution, out of step with a public that largely sees Lindsay as a victim of an undiagnosed illness and a broken medical response, rather than a calculating killer. All three of those threads, the husband, the state police, the prosecutors, exist almost entirely outside the four corners of the actual evidence, and none of them have been substantiated by anything presented in court. But they matter, because they show just how much this case has become a referendum on things far bigger than one family's tragedy, how the public perceives maternal mental illness, how much benefit of the doubt institutions get after a string of prior controversies, and how quickly online sleuthing fills a vacuum left by a trial that's dragged on, in various delayed forms, for more than 3 years. So here's the second question we want from you. Now that you've heard both what's in the courtroom and what's circulating outside it, does the online conspiracy chatter around this case help hold institutions accountable, or does it just pile more pain onto a family that's already lost everything? Tell us where you land, because the answer might shift by the time this trial actually ends. In just the last few days, the trial has taken another turn entirely, this time centered on Lindsay's own phone. A digital forensics analyst testified this week that he had pulled writings and search history straight off her device, including a note describing her mental state as steadily going downhill, alongside entries where she talked about wanting a fourth child while acknowledging she first needed to find a genuinely good therapist. Prosecutors have leaned hard on a different piece of that same digital trail, an Apple Maps search they argue shows Lindsay actively mapping out her plan before it happened, evidence Reddington dismissed on cross as far less conclusive than the Commonwealth is treating it. That same stretch of testimony also produced one of the trial's tensest exchanges yet, with attorneys clashing openly over whether Lindsay had been coached to tell doctors she was hearing voices, a fight that goes straight to whether her psychosis diagnosis can be trusted at all. And outside the courtroom, the online reaction has only hardened along the way, with legal commentators and casual observers increasingly public about which side they think is losing, several going so far as to call the Commonwealth's handling of its own digital evidence a genuinely poor showing. As of this recording, the trial is still underway in Plymouth Superior Court, now well into its second week of testimony from the State Medical Examiner's Office and digital forensics witnesses, years after the killings themselves, after repeated delays over medical records, after a legal fight to obtain Patrick's unpublished interview notes from The New Yorker, and after a jury selection process that specifically screened for jurors who could set aside any pre-existing distrust of Massachusetts law enforcement. If convicted of first-degree murder, Lindsay faces a mandatory sentence of life in prison. If the jury instead finds she lacked criminal responsibility due to mental illness, she would likely be committed indefinitely to a state psychiatric facility rather than a prison, a legal outcome the public frequently misunderstands as an acquittal, when in practice it can mean confinement for the rest of her life either way. What's left, then, is the same contradiction we opened with, a prosecution calling witness after witness who described the woman they're trying to convict as a devoted, gentle mother, while arguing in the same breath that she carried out a calculated triple murder. Somewhere between those two realities is whatever actually happened inside that Duxbury home on January 24, 2023, and it's still, right now, sitting in the hands of 18 jurors in Plymouth County. We'll be following this case as it moves toward its resolution. Subscribe to The Fatal Truth so you don't miss what the jury ultimately decides.